A hired gun rode for her water, and Maren Cole spent her last $3 hiring a drifter to guard her gate, never guessing he would change everything before that gun and 3 more like it ever reached her land. That same morning, 40 miles east, a cattle baron's paymaster was counting out considerably more silver into considerably uglier hands, hiring 4 guns to finish what threats alone hadn't managed to do, and neither payroll knew the other existed yet. She thought she'd hired a ragged saddle-tramp to sit by her gate and look armed. What she'd actually done was put the deadliest gunslinger alive between her ranch and every man who meant to burn her out. And she wouldn't understand the size of that mistake, the good kind, the kind that saves a life, until the night the shooting started. Now let me set this proper, because a story like this deserves its dust before the trouble comes calling. It was the spring of 1884, Coronado County, Arizona Territory, a stretch of grass and rock country that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be good ranch land or a graveyard, and most days lately it looked like it might settle on the second one. Before I take you back to that morning at the gate, do an old storyteller a kindness. Hit that subscribe button, get comfortable in whatever chair's holding you tonight, and drop a line in the comments telling me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's riding along with me on nights like this one. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a widow named Maren, a drifter who called himself Silas, and a cattle baron who thought $3 a month was a joke worth killing over. Let's ride back to where it started. Maren Cole was 26 years old that spring, and she had buried her husband Daniel 11 months prior, thrown from a green horse he'd bought cheap and shouldn't have trusted. And she had spent every one of those 11 months learning exactly how much of a ranch a woman could hold together with her own 2 hands, and how much she couldn't. She was beautiful in the particular way the frontier made women beautiful, not soft, not painted, but weathered into something sharper and more honest. Sun at her collarbones and calluses across her palms, and a jaw that had learned to set itself against bad news before the news even finished arriving. She'd grown up in Missouri farm country, married Daniel at 19, followed him west with nothing but 2 wagons and a stubborn kind of hope, and built alongside him a spread of 400 acres straddling the only reliable creek for 11 miles in any direction. That creek was the whole story. That creek was also, as it turned out, the whole problem. She wasn't a woman who cried easy, and asking for help came harder still, which was its own kind of trouble, because by that spring she badly needed both the courage not to cry and the sense to ask. She'd been raised to believe a woman managed, quietly and without complaint, whatever life put in front of her, and for 11 months she'd tried to live up to that raising, even as the ranch bled money out from under her faster than she could staunch it. She ran 40 head of cattle down from the 120 Daniel had left her, sold off equipment piece by piece to cover a mortgage note that had come due twice already, and woke every single morning telling herself this was the year things turned around. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's calm, and neither of those things pays a mortgage note, not by themselves. Not when the man across the valley has decided your water belongs to him by right of wanting it badly enough. That man was Cyrus Vane, and he ran 8,000 head of cattle on land that had once been plenty but wasn't anymore, not with 3 dry years stacked one on top of the other in a herd that size drinking a river dry twice over. Vane had built his outfit the old-fashioned way, which is to say he'd built it by being first to a lot of land nobody else wanted yet, and mean enough to keep it once it turned valuable. He wasn't young, he was pushing 60, silver-headed, soft around the middle now in a way that made him look almost grandfatherly to strangers who hadn't yet watched him ruin somebody. He'd bought out or burned out 4 smaller outfits along that creek in 6 years in Maren's 400 acres, with its year-round water in its position controlling the only easy crossing for 20 miles, was the last piece keeping his empire from running clean from the Coronado Hills to the Territorial Road. Vane didn't hate Maren personally. That was almost the worst part of him. He simply didn't think of her as a person standing in his way so much as an inconvenience with a deed attached, the same way a man might resent a boulder sitting in a road he intended to widen. He'd sent an offer first, low enough to insult her, and when Maren turned it down flat, Vane started applying weather of his own making. Fence lines cut in the night, a watering trough poisoned with something that killed 6 of her remaining cattle over one bad week. A rider who came by at dusk, polite as Sunday, mentioning that accidents happened to lone women on isolated spreads. And wasn't it a shame nobody could ever prove who caused them? None of it was loud enough to bring the law down on him. And all of it was loud enough to keep Maren lying awake past midnight listening for hoofbeats that weren't there yet. Vane hadn't done his own dirty work in years, and the men he'd hired to do it for him deserved naming, because a story like this one is only as honest as the wolves it sets loose. Leading them was Amos Grail, a broad-shouldered man who wore his cruelty like other men wear cologne, liberally and without shame. Twice fired from ranch outfits for beating hired hands half senseless over car debts that were never his business to collect. Beside him rode Fenwick Cobb, lean and quiet, a gun hand who drank nothing, gambled nothing, and had killed 9 men for money across 3 territories, mostly from ambush, mostly without a flicker of feeling either way. There was a heavy-set brawler named Otto Reyes, who liked fire more than any sane man ought to, and had already burned 2 homesteads to their foundations that spring under Vane's quiet instruction, calling it persuasion, the way a man calls a slap discipline. And there was the 4th, a rangy young gun named Purdy Slate, fast and vain about it, forever practicing his draw in front of any reflective surface he could find, who had never once faced a man who could actually match him, which made him the most dangerous kind of dangerous there is, the kind who doesn't yet know what fear tastes like. Greed dressed up as ranching, cruelty dressed up as toughness, an arsonist's appetite dressed up as strategy, a young man's vanity dressed up as skill. 4 vices, riding 4 horses, and Vane paid every one of them considerably more than $3 a month to make Maren Cole's life unlivable. None of those 4 had ever laid eyes on Vane doing anything but signing their pay envelopes in his ranch house study, which suited him fine. He'd built his whole career on staying 2 steps back from anything that might someday need explaining to a judge, preferring paper trails that led nowhere and men who didn't ask hard questions as long as the money kept coming on schedule. And in 6 years of quietly acquiring his neighbor's land, that arrangement had never once failed him. Vane's study told its own story to anybody who bothered looking close, which almost nobody ever did, because Vane made sure of it. Ledgers stacked neat on one corner of the desk, showing a man of careful habits and modest ambition, the kind of rancher a banker trusted on sight. The second set of ledgers, kept in a locked drawer beneath the first, told a rather different story, one of water rights bought under false names, of small outfits driven under by fires that always seemed to start on the driest night of the month, of a pattern repeating itself across 6 years with the patience of a spider that never once had to chase its dinner, only wait for it to wander close enough to the web. Vane had learned that patience from his own father, a man who'd built and lost 2 fortunes back east before finally teaching his son the one lesson that stuck. Land doesn't care who owns it, only who's still standing at the end of the argument over who does. He'd looked at Maren's 400 acres the way he looked at every piece of ground he eventually swallowed, not as somebody's home, not as a widow's whole remaining life, but as an inconvenient gap in an otherwise finished picture. He told himself, some nights, that he was doing the country a favor, consolidating scattered little holdings into one efficient operation the way progress always demanded of people too sentimental to see it coming. It was a comfortable lie, the kind rich men tell themselves, so the mirror stays easy to look at in the morning, and Vane had gotten very good at believing his own comfortable lies over the years. Maren didn't know the full shape of any of that yet, not that morning. What she knew was that she was down to no hired man at all, since old Purdy, who'd worked the place since before Daniel died, had finally admitted his knees couldn't take another season and ridden off toward his daughter's place in Prescott. What she knew was that the fence Vane's men had cut twice already needed a body watching it day and night, and that she had exactly $11 left in the tin box under her floorboards after the mortgage note and the seed order and the vet bill for the cattle the poison hadn't quite finished killing. $11 doesn't hire much of anything. It hires, if a woman's lucky and a man's desperate enough, one broke drifter willing to sit by a gate for a wage that wouldn't have covered a decent meal in Tucson. She found him at the Mercantile in the crossroads town of Wren's Junction, standing at the counter trying to trade a worn-out saddle for enough credit to cover a sack of beans, the storekeeper giving him the particular hard time storekeepers reserve for men who look like they haven't eaten regular in a while. He was maybe 40, though it was hard to tell exactly, the kind of weathering on his face that could have put 5 years on a man or 15. His duster had gone the color of dust itself, patched twice at the shoulder. His boots had walked further than they had any business walking without falling clean apart. A plain gun belt rode his hip, a Colt that looked well cared for despite everything else about him looking worn past caring. And if Maren had known to look closer at that particular detail, the gun clean and oiled while the man himself looked half-starved, she might have understood something important a full month earlier than she eventually did. But nobody looks that close at a broke stranger buying beans on credit. Nobody ever does. I need a man to watch my gate. She'd stepped up beside him before she'd fully decided to. I can pay $3 a month. A bunk in the barn, and meals. It isn't much. He gave her a long look, the kind that took in more than most men's looks took in. Her hands, her boots, the set of her shoulders, the particular tightness around her eyes that said she hadn't slept a full night in longer than she'd admit. $3 was all he said back. No insult in it, just a flat kind of confirming. $3. She held his eyes even though shame was climbing up her throat at how little the number was. I won't pretend it's fair wage for a man's time. It's what I've got. I'll take it. No haggling, no complaint. Just a man who apparently needed a roof and a meal badly enough that $3 looked like salvation. His name was Silas, he told her, and no last name came with it, and she didn't press for one. Because out on that frontier a man's last name was frequently the least honest thing about him anyway. She rode home that afternoon with a stranger trailing a length behind her on a horse nearly as worn-looking as its rider, telling herself this was a foolish, desperate arrangement, hiring a man she knew nothing about to guard the one thing left worth guarding, and telling herself simultaneously that she had no other choice left standing. Both of those thoughts were true at once the way true things on the frontier so often were. Now, the thing about Silas that Maren couldn't have known, the thing that would have changed everything about that first conversation if she had, was this. 6 years back, in the New Mexico territory, a man had gone by a different name entirely. A name that had gathered so much reputation around it that the man himself eventually found it easier to bury the name than keep answering to it. Some counties called him the Coronado Ghost. Others called him the Devil's Own. Neither name was flattering, and both were accurate in their own particular way. He'd been the fastest, coldest gun for hire in 4 territories. Not a bounty man exactly, more the kind of man ranchers and cattle companies quietly paid to settle disputes that courts moved too slow to settle. And he had settled a great many disputes and buried a great many men. Right up until the morning he looked at his own 2 hands, after a job gone bad, and understood he couldn't keep doing what those hands were good at without losing whatever was left of the man who used to own them before the killing started. He'd walked away from that life 4 years prior, walked away from a reputation worth more money than most territorial governors made in a year, and he'd been drifting ever since, taking small honest work where he found it, refusing every offer that smelled like violence, trying to become nobody, in particular the same slow, patient way a man files down a blade until the edge stops cutting anybody, including himself. $3 a month to watch a widow's gate suited him just fine. It was small and honest and asked nothing of the parts of him he'd sworn off using. What Silas noticed, Riding in behind Maren that first afternoon toward the ranch house, sitting low against the Coronado hills, was the cut fence line along the north pasture, mended twice already with wire that didn't quite match, and the burn patch near the barn that hadn't been there long, and the particular stillness of a woman who'd learned to flinch at hoofbeats she didn't recognize. He didn't say anything about any of it that first day. He simply noted it, filed it away the way a man files away weather coming, and went about the business of being exactly what he'd been hired to be, a broke saddle-tramp, glad of a bunk and a meal. The first 2 weeks passed quiet enough that Maren started to relax in small ways. She hadn't let herself relax in months. Silas mended fence without being asked twice, doctored a sick calf with more skill than a common drifter ought to have had, and sat most evenings on an overturned crate by the gate, rifle across his knees, watching the road with a patience that seemed almost restful rather than tense. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was plain and useful, never wasted on complaint or boast, and Maren found herself, against her own better judgment, starting to trust the particular quality of a man's silence. That's a dangerous thing to trust, and sometimes on that frontier, the only honest measure a person had available. It was the third week when Grail rode up to that gate for the first time since Silas had arrived, and everything about the visit told a story if you knew how to read it. He came with 2 other riders, Reyes and young Purdy Slate, pulling up short at the gate the way a man pulls up short when something doesn't sit right, his eyes going straight past Maren to the ragged stranger standing easy by the fence post, rifle resting loose in the crook of his arm. Didn't know you'd hired help, something testing in it, something feeling for a soft spot. I don't answer to you for who I hire. Maren was proud, later, of how steady her voice came out, even though her heart was going like a rabbit's under her ribs. Grail looked at Silas a long moment, the particular assessing look one dangerous man gives another without either of them saying so out loud, and something flickered behind his eyes that he didn't examine closely enough, a half-formed recognition he couldn't place and didn't bother chasing, because who in their right mind expects to find the most feared gun in 4 territories, standing broke and ragged at a widow's gate for $3 a month? Grail dismissed the flicker as nothing. That dismissal would cost him everything eventually, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Mr. Duan. Vane extends his respects, he said instead, turning back to Maren, and his hope you'll reconsider his offer before this Creek country turns unfriendly for a woman alone.
Tell Mr.
Vane, I buried one husband already teaching me what men's promises are worth. Her chin came up. I don't need a second lesson. Grail's jaw tightened at that, his horse shifting under him the way horses shift when their riders go tense. And for a moment the air at that gate had the particular electric quality of something about to happen. Then Silas shifted his weight just slightly, just enough to remind everybody present that he was there, rifle still resting easy but no longer quite so restful looking, and Grail, reading a threat he couldn't quite name and didn't like the shape of, decided the moment wasn't worth pushing. He wheeled his horse and rode off with his 2 men, and Maren let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thank you, she said it once the dust had settled. Wasn't much of anything. He kept his eyes on the road even after the riders had gone. Man like that backs off a stare most days, won't always. She should have asked him what he meant by that. She didn't, not yet, because some part of her, the part still exhausted from 11 months of grief and fence mending and mortgage notes, didn't want to know the answer badly enough to ask the question. If you're still riding with me, tell me down in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I want to know how far this story's traveling. Now let's get back to Coronado County, because the quiet wasn't going to hold much longer. The days after that gate confrontation had a different texture to them, tighter, more watchful, the kind of quiet that isn't peace so much as a held breath. Maren noticed Silas changing small things around the property without asking permission first, moving the woodpile to give clearer sightlines from the porch, mending a gap in the barn wall that let a man see the approach road without being seen himself, checking the loads in a rifle he kept now within easy reach at all times instead of leaned casual against the wall. She noticed, and one evening while she was scrubbing supper plates, and he was cleaning that same well-kept Colt at the kitchen table, she finally asked, "You've done this before?" Not quite a question. He didn't look up right away. Done what? Watched for men who mean to come back and hurt somebody. He set the cloth down. The silence stretched a moment, and Maren found herself holding still the way a person holds still, around something that might spook. "I've seen my share of men like Grail. Learn to read what they're fixing to do before they do it. That's all watching is, ma'am. Paying closer attention than the other fellow expects." It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even close to the whole truth. But it was true enough, as far as it went, and Maren let it sit there without pushing further. Some instinct in her older-than reason telling her that whatever this quiet drifter was holding back, it wasn't a danger to her. If anything, the opposite. That instinct got tested 3 nights later, when Otto Reyes rode through under cover of dark with a torch and a bottle of coal oil, meaning to finish the job he'd started on 2 other homesteads that spring. What Reyes didn't count on was a man already awake on the porch, already watching, who put a warning shot through Reyes's saddle horn close enough to feel the wind of it before the torch had done more than catch flame. Reyes rode off cursing into the dark coal oil bottle shattered in the dirt behind him, and word of that failed burning reached Grail and Vane before the sun was even fully up. That was the moment things stopped being a slow squeeze and started being a war, though it took Vane another week to understand exactly what kind of war he'd started, and by then it was already too late to undo it. He sat in his study going over the reports his men brought back, a stranger who moved wrong for a broke drifter, who read danger a full breath before it arrived, who put warning shots exactly where warning shots needed to go without wasting a single one. And something cold started forming in the back of his mind, a memory he didn't want to be true and couldn't quite dismiss either. Fenwick. He kept his voice level, the way he always did with Cobb, the only one of his hired men he bothered treating as more than muscle. Ride out and look at this hired man of the widow's yourself. Don't approach him, just look. Cobb rode out 2 days later, keeping his distance, watching from a ridge with a spyglass while Silas worked fence in the pasture below, and what he saw in the particular economy of that man's movements, no wasted motion, a stillness between actions that read like a held breath, raised the hair on the back of his neck in a way 9 years of killing men for money had never quite managed. Cobb had heard the old stories, same as every gun in 4 territories had heard them, about a fastest hand who'd made problems disappear and gone quiet 4 years back after some job that broke something in him even Cobb's contacts couldn't fully explain. He rode back to Vane's ranch house that evening, carrying both what he'd seen and what he suspected, though suspicion wasn't proof. And Vane wasn't a man who acted on suspicion alone, not yet, not with that much land finally within reach. Even if it's him, he's one man. Vane turned a whiskey glass slow between his fingers. "I've got 4. You got 4. Cobb's voice stayed flat the way it always did. "Against maybe the only man in this territory who's killed more people than all 4 of us put together." Vane didn't answer that directly. He poured himself another whiskey, told Cobb the job hadn't changed, the widow's land was still the last piece he needed, and the timeline hadn't gotten any longer just because a broke stranger made Cobb nervous on a ridge. Greed, once it's traveled 6 years down a particular road, rarely turns around just because the road ahead looks steeper than expected. Back at the ranch, Maren had started noticing something else about Silas. Something that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the particular ache of a woman who'd been alone longer than she wanted to admit. He was kind in a way that didn't announce itself, fixing the hinge on her mother's old trunk without being asked, noticing when she hadn't eaten enough and quietly setting more on her plate before she could protest, sitting with her some evenings on the porch in a silence that felt less like absence and more like company. She caught herself more than once, watching the line of his jaw in the lamplight and feeling something stir that she'd told herself 11 months ago she'd buried along with Daniel. "You don't have to sit up with me every night." She said it mostly because the alternative, saying nothing, felt like admitting she didn't want him to stop. "I know I don't have to." Something in his voice had gone quieter, more careful. The voice of a man picking his way across ground he wasn't sure would hold his weight. "I want to." She didn't answer that directly, but she didn't get up and go inside either, and the two of them sat together in the dark a while longer, listening to the cattle settle and the wind move through the cottonwoods along the creek, and something between them shifted a little further that night, quiet as a held breath, towards something neither one was ready to name out loud just yet. It was 2 nights after that when Silas finally told her the truth, not because he wanted to, but because he decided she deserved to choose what came next with her eyes open rather than blind. They sat at that same kitchen table, gun laid out in pieces for cleaning, his voice flat and careful the way a man's voice goes when he's confessing something he's ashamed of. "My name wasn't always Silas. Man I used to be. They called him the Coronado Ghost in some counties. Hired gun. Not law, not quite outlaw either, just a man ranchers and cattle companies paid to settle things. Courts moved too slow to settle. I was good at it. Better than good. I killed more men in 6 years than I could give you an honest count of, and I told myself every single time the man on the other end of my gun had it coming, and mostly God help me, he did. But a man can't keep doing that work forever without it hollowing something out of him that doesn't grow back easy." Maren sat very still listening, her hands gone motionless around her coffee cup. 4 years back I walked away, buried the name, took up drifting, told myself I'd never pick up that particular kind of work again. $3 a month to watch a widow's gate seemed like about as far from that old life as a man could get. He looked up at her then, something raw and unguarded in his face she hadn't seen from him before. "I should have told you sooner. Figured you had a right to decide whether you wanted that kind of history sleeping in your barn." "Are you dangerous to me?" It was the only question that mattered. No, immediate, certain, the first time she'd heard him answer anything without measuring the words first. "Never to you. To the men circling this ranch, though, I expect I'm about the most dangerous thing that's ridden into this county in years. And it's looking like they're going to force the question of exactly how dangerous sooner rather than later." She should have been afraid. Some part of her was, but a larger part of her, the part that had spent 11 months carrying a widow's whole weight alone, felt something closer to relief. The specific relief of understanding that the quiet stranger beside her wasn't merely willing to stand between her and Vane's men. He was, perhaps, the one man in the territory actually capable of winning that fight outright. "Then I'm glad," she said slowly. $3 was all I had to offer, because it seems to have bought considerably more than it should have. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face, the first one she'd seen from him since he'd arrived. "Might be the finest $3 anybody ever spent," he allowed. And for a moment, sitting there in the lamplight with danger circling closer outside, it felt almost like an ordinary evening between two ordinary people, and both of them let themselves have that moment before the world came calling again. He gave her the rest of it over the nights that followed, carefully, in pieces, the way a man rations out a story he's ashamed of so it doesn't overwhelm the telling. There had been a wife once, long before any of this, dead of fever while he was 200 miles away collecting on a job, and that particular grief had been the first crack in the wall he built around the killing part of himself. There had been the job that finally broke him for good. A rancher who'd hired him to settle a land dispute that turned out to be considerably less honest than he'd been told. A young man dead who hadn't deserved it, and the morning after, looking at his own hands and understanding he couldn't trust himself to keep doing that work and stay a man worth being. And there had been 4 years of drifting since, small honest jobs, every offer that smelled of violence turned down flat, trying to file the edge off a blade that had been sharpened for killing. Maren listened to all of it without flinching, and something in her own chest loosened as she listened, because grief, she was learning, recognizes grief. And a woman who'd spent 11 months learning to carry a dead husband's whole ranch alone understood something true about a man who'd spent 4 years trying to carry his own dead weight quietly, without complaint, without asking anybody to help him carry it. There was a night, near the end of that week of confessions, when Silas built a small fire out past the corral, more out of old habit than any need for warmth, and the two of them sat close beside it while the stars came out hard and bright over the Coronado hills, the way they only do in high, dry country far from any town's lamplight. He told her that night about the winter he'd spent alone in the Mogollon high country after he first walked away from the killing life. 3 months without seeing another living soul, living off what he could trap and what little he'd saved, and how he'd nearly frozen twice and welcomed the cold both times, because at least the cold was an honest kind of suffering, not the kind a man brings down on other people for money. He told her he'd started talking to his horse just to remember how his own voice sounded, and that admission made her laugh for the first time since the fire had been lit. A real laugh, surprised out of her, and something in his chest loosened to hear it. "What made you stop talking to the horse?" she asked, still smiling, "and start talking to people again? Found honest work here and there. A rancher who needed fence mended in Socorro. A livery man in Silver City who needed somebody who wouldn't steal from the till. Small towns, small jobs. Nobody asking my history so long as the work got done right." He fed a stick into the fire, watched the sparks climb. "Guess I forgot some how it felt to be looked at like an ordinary man instead of a rumor. Took me the better part of 2 years to stop flinching every time somebody looked at me twice. And now I'm sitting by a fire with a woman who knows the worst of what I've done and hasn't run for the house yet." He looked at her sideways, something almost boyish in it despite the weathering on his face. "Reckon it's about the best now I've had in longer than I care to count." She didn't run for the house. She stayed by that fire until it burned down to embers, and something between them settled deeper that night than either of them said out loud. The particular quiet understanding of two people who'd both been broken by loss and were, slowly, cautiously, finding out they could still be whole standing next to somebody else who understood exactly what that kind of breaking cost. "I'm not asking you to be anybody but who you are sitting here." She meant it entirely. "But if those men come for this ranch, I won't pretend I'm sorry you know how to stop them. Whatever this was building toward between them, tenderness or something with a harder name attached, it had to wait, because 3 days after that conversation, Vane finally ran out of patience entirely. He'd tried the polite offer. He'd tried the fence cutting and the poison trough and the failed burning. He'd sent his lead man to test the water at her gate and gotten a flat refusal for his trouble. And now, with a stranger on that property who Cobb suspected, and Vane himself was starting to fear, might be the single most dangerous gun in 4 territories. Vane made the choice that greedy men so often make when patience runs thin and the prize sits close enough to smell. He decided to finish it all in one night, hard and fast, before that stranger could organize any more defense than he already had. "All 4 of you. Tonight." He said it to his men gathered in the study, lamplight throwing long shadows up the walls. "I want that ranch house burned to the foundation and that widow off my crate by sunup, and if that drifter of hers gets in the way, you put him in the ground same as you would any other obstacle." A flicker of the fear Cobb had planted in him surfaced, despite his best effort to suppress it. 4 against 1, even if Cobb's right about who he is. 4 against 1 settles most arguments. Silas had spent those same 3 days preparing, Quiet and thorough, the way a man prepares who's done this kind of preparation more times than he could easily count. He walked to property with Maren at his side, teaching her the ground the way he'd once taught greener men to read hostile country, naming every rock and shadow and gap in the fence line out loud, so she'd know it in the dark as well as she knew it by day. He showed her where the water trough gave cover from 3 different angles, where the woodpile was stacked solid enough to stop a rifle round if it came to that, where the root cellar doors sat half hidden behind the rain barrel, so a man circling the yard in darkness would walk right past it without ever knowing it was there. Woodpile solid enough to stop a round if it comes to that. He tapped it once with his boot to prove the point. And if I tell you to get to the root cellar, you get. You don't argue. You don't look back to see how I'm doing. You understand me? I understand. Something in her chest tightened at the thought of leaving him to face 4 armed men alone, but she nodded anyway because his plan was the only plan either of them had. He handed her a pistol that evening, a plain, well-kept revolver he'd carried since long before he'd ever heard the name Coronado Ghost attached to himself, and walked her through loading it, aiming it, the particular calm a person needed to hold in their hands when everything in them wanted to shake. Slow hands. Clear eyes. He watched her thumb the hammer back and ease it down twice before he let her load a live round. Fear doesn't leave you. It just stops running things, if you let your training take over instead. She practiced until her arm ached and her ears rang from the dry fire clicks. Dry firing into the dark yard until the motion stopped feeling foreign in her hands, and something settled into her over those hours that hadn't been there before. Not quite courage exactly, more the specific confidence of a woman who understood, finally, that she wasn't merely waiting to be saved. She was becoming somebody capable of doing some of the saving herself. Silas walked her through the worst of it too, plain and unflinching, because he decided somewhere along the way that lying to her about what was coming would be its own kind of cruelty. Men would likely be hurt. Some might die. She might have to watch it happen close enough to smell the powder, and she might have to be the one holding the gun when it did. He didn't dress any of that up in easier words than it deserved, and Maren, to her own quiet surprise, found she was grateful for the plain telling rather than frightened worse by it. She'd spent 11 months being handled carefully by well-meaning neighbors who assumed grief made a woman fragile clean through, and there was something almost restorative about a man who trusted her enough to tell her the truth of a coming fight without softening a single edge of it. "You're not asking if I can handle it," she said midway through one of those hard conversations, checking the pistol's weight in her hand for what felt like the 100th time that week. "No," he agreed. "I already know you can. I'm just making sure you walk in with your eyes open instead of finding out the hard way what open eyes might have spared you." That distinction mattered to her more than she could easily explain, and it settled something further between them, the sense that whatever else this partnership was becoming, it was built on a foundation of plain truth rather than protective lies, and a foundation like that tends to hold weight a good deal longer than the kind built on comfortable pretending. On the second evening of preparation, with the light going gold and low over the Coronado hills, Silas sat with her on the porch step and told her one more thing he hadn't managed to say yet, something that had nothing to do with rifles or root cellars. "Whatever happens out there when they come," he said low, "I want you to know I wasn't lying about any of it. Not the $3, not the watching, none of it. This is the first place in 4 years that's felt like it might be worth staying in for good, past whatever job needed doing." She reached over and put her hand over his, calloused palm against calloused palm, and didn't say anything for a long moment, because some things don't need an answer right away. They just need to be heard and held on to. "Then stay," she finally said. "After, however this goes, stay." They didn't have long to wait after that. 2 nights later, the sound came across the dark pasture just after midnight. 4 riders moving with more caution than confidence, torches unlit yet. meaning to get close before announcing themselves the way cowards and professionals both tend to prefer. "They're here." Maren crouched behind the water trough exactly where Silas had positioned her, pistol steady in both hands the way he'd taught her. Her pulse loud enough in her own ears that she had to remind herself to breathe the way he'd shown her. Slow in, slower out. "I know." Silas checked the cylinder of his Colt one final time. The old, careful ritual of a man about to do the thing he'd sworn off doing. Except this time for a reason he could finally live with. Stay low, stay quiet. He looked at her a long moment in the dark. "And Maren, whatever happens tonight, I meant every word I told you on that porch step. All of it." "I know you did." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Now go finish this so we can both still be standing come morning." Grail came in first. Torch finally lit once they'd closed enough distance that stealth stopped mattering. And behind him rode Reyes with a second torch and a fresh bottle of coal oil, and behind them Cobb, quiet and watchful as always, rifle already up and searching the dark porch for a target. Purdy Slate brought up the rear, young and eager and about to discover, in the space of the next several minutes, exactly what fear tasted like for the first time in his short, violent career. "Come on out, old man." Grail's voice carried that particular false confidence men wear when they've got numbers on their side and haven't yet learned that numbers don't always win. "Vane wants this place burned tonight, and there's no version of this where you and the widow ride away from it. Make it easy on yourselves." Silas stepped off the porch into the torchlight, unhurried, hands loose at his sides. And something in the specific quality of that walk, no wasted motion, no hesitation, made even Grail's horse shift uneasy beneath him. "You got about 4 seconds to turn those horses around and ride back to Vane and tell him the widow's land isn't for sale and never will be. After that, I stop offering seconds." Grail laughed. That particular ugly laugh men used to convince themselves and everybody listening that they're still the ones in control. "Cobb thinks you're somebody special, some old ghost story come to life. I think you're a broke drifter about to die for $3 a month. Ask Cobb how special he thinks I am. In about 10 seconds you'll have your answer." Cobb, to his credit, had already started backing his horse a step. Some old professional instinct screaming louder than Vane's orders, but it was Grail who moved first, going for his gun with the confidence of a man who'd never once faced somebody faster, and the confidence didn't survive contact with the truth. Silas's hand moved the way a man's hand moves when he's ending an argument rather than starting a show, and the revolver in Grail's fist went spinning into the dirt before his finger ever cleared leather, a shot that took the gun and not the man. Because some part of Silas, even now, even facing the worst of Vane's crew, was still trying to hold on to the version of himself that didn't need to kill to win. Reyes flung his torch and reached for a second bottle of coal oil, meaning to set the whole yard alight regardless of what happened to his own crew. And that was the moment Maren rose up from behind the water trough and put a round into the dirt, directly in front of his horse's forelegs, close enough to spook the animal into a raring panic that sent both torch and coal oil bottle tumbling uselessly into a rain barrel, hissing out in a cloud of steam and smoke. "She's armed!" Real fear cracked through Purdy Slate's shout now. The fear of a young man discovering all at once that the numbers he'd been counting on weren't the numbers that mattered. Cobb, professional to the last, understood the fight had already turned before most men would have noticed, and he brought his rifle up fast. Faster than Grail had managed, aiming not at Silas directly, but at the shadow near the water trough where Maren crouched. It was the single worst decision of his 9-year career, because Silas had been waiting precisely for a man to make that particular choice. The answering shot came before Cobb's finger ever fully closed on his own trigger, catching him high in the shoulder and spinning him hard off his horse into the dirt, rifle clattering away useless. Purdy Slate, young and vain and suddenly understanding exactly how far his practiced quick draw fell short of the real thing, made the wisest choice of his young life and put both hands up before he'd even fully drawn, dropping his gun into the dust and backing his horse away with his palms showing plain in what torchlight remained. For a moment the yard held nothing but drifting smoke and the ragged breathing of wounded men, and one very frightened young gun hand with his hands still raised. And Grail, disarmed and staring at a stranger who'd just proven every rumor Cobb had whispered entirely true, finally asked the question that had been circling the whole territory for 4 years, without an answer. "Who in the hell are you? Man who watches gates for $3 a month. No cruelty in it, just a flat, tired truth. And a man who used to be somebody worse, before I decided I'd rather be this instead. Tell Vane the widow's land stays hers, and tell him if he sends anybody else up this road, I stop offering warning shots." They rode off into the dark, carrying Cobb slumped and bleeding across his saddle. Grail's pride in worse shape than his gun hand, Purdy Slate white-faced and silent the whole way, and Maren stood slowly from behind the water trough, pistol still gripped tight in both hands, watching the last of the torchlight fade toward the eastern road. "Is it over?" Some part of her already suspected the honest answer. Vane's over. Whether he understands that himself yet is a different question. Silas holstered the Colt slow, and for the first time all night, his shoulders came down from around his ears. Vane understood it inside the week. Once Grail limped home with a story, and Cobb's wounded shoulder confirmed every fear Cobb himself had planted. And once word started moving through Coronado County the way word does after a night like that one, quiet at first, then louder, about a ragged drifter who'd turned back 4 armed men without killing a single one of them out of some old, buried mercy he still hadn't entirely let go of. Vane tried, briefly, to buy silence and buy time, sending a lawyer instead of gunmen, threatening suits over water rights that had never actually been in question. But a territorial judge who'd heard enough whispered stories about the Coronado ghost himself took one look at the sworn statements Maren provided. Statements from 3 separate witnesses in Wren's Junction who'd seen Grail's crew ride toward her ranch that night with torches and coal oil already prepared, and ruled against Vane on every count that mattered. It wasn't a clean ending, and I want to be honest with you about that because clean endings mostly happen in stories, not in life. Vane kept most of his cattle empire, chastened but not broken, and men like Vane rarely pay the whole price for what they've done, not all at once. Not in ways that satisfy a person's sense of justice entirely, but he lost the water rights to Maren's Creek for good, lost 2 of his hired guns to other territories. Once word of that failed raid spread, and spent the rest of that year, by every account that reached Wren's Junction afterward, a considerably more careful and considerably less confident man than he'd been that spring. Reyes drifted south into Sonora looking for smaller trouble to make, and Purdy Slate, they say, never drew his pistol on another living soul again, having learned in one long night exactly how far a young man's vanity carries him once it meets something real. Maren kept her ranch. She kept 2. Something she hadn't expected to find again after burying Daniel 11 months prior, a quiet, hard-won kind of partnership with a man who'd walked into her life ragged and broke and left it having given her back a version of herself she hadn't known. She still had in her the version who could stand behind a water trough with a pistol in both hands and hold her ground against men who'd meant to burn everything she loved to the foundation. In the weeks after the siege, the ranch settled into a rhythm neither of them had known in a long while. Mornings spent mending what the last dry year had worn down. Evenings spent on that same porch step where an understanding at first passed quiet between them. Silas rebuilt the section of fence Reyes' torch had come closest to, though it hadn't caught, more out of the habit of finishing what needed finishing than any real necessity. Maren found herself laughing again, small and surprised at her own laughter, in a way she hadn't laughed since long before Daniel's accident. And more than once she caught Silas watching her across the yard with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. He never went looking for the old name or the old reputation once it was over, and folks who valued their own safety mostly let both rest quiet. But he stopped flinching at being recognized the way he had those first weeks. because there's a particular peace that comes to a dangerous man once the last debt from his old life finally gets paid in full. He took on breaking horses for two of the smaller outfits along the creek that hadn't fallen to Vane's ambitions. Steady, honest work that suited the man he was trying to become far better than any gun ever had. And folks in Wren's Junction, who'd once have crossed the street from a ragged stranger, found themselves nodding to him by name at the mercantile, the way you'd nod to anybody else who paid his debts and kept his word. He and Maren married the following spring. A small ceremony at the ranch house with the cottonwoods just greening along the creek, half of Wren's Junction turning out for it, because half of Wren's Junction had heard by then some version of the story of the night the widow's hired drifter turned back Cyrus Vane's whole crew without losing a single life on either side of that gunfight. Maren wore her mother's old blue dress, let out at the seams, and Silas stood at that ceremony in a coat someone had lent him for the occasion, looking, more than one witness said afterward, like a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what walking upright without it felt like. If you asked around Wren's Junction even now, older folks will tell you they still see him some mornings out working that same fence line, rifle within easy reach out of old habit, watching the road the way a man watches who's learned exactly what waits for people who mistake quiet for weakness. They'll tell you, too, about the two children who came along in the years after, a boy who took after his father's stillness, and a girl who took after her mother's stubborn nerve, and about a ranch that grew, slow and steady, into the kind of place travelers spoke well of when they passed through that stretch of Coronado County, water plentiful, gate always open to anybody who came in good faith. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight, and it's simple, though simple doesn't always mean easy. Never assume the cheapest wage buys the least protection. And never assume the most broken-looking stranger at your gate is exactly what he appears to be. Cruelty and greed both make that mistake constantly, sizing people up by their clothes and their circumstances instead of what's actually sitting quiet underneath, and it costs them every single time somebody like Silas is standing on the other side of that mistake. Maren wasn't rescued so much as she found somebody willing to stand beside her while she finished learning how strong she already was. And together the two of them proved that $3, paid in good faith to the right stranger, can sometimes be worth more than any fortune a man like Vane ever built on cruelty and other people's fear. If this story rode with you tonight, do an old storyteller a kindness. Hit that subscribe button. Tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, and stick around for the next one. Because next time we're heading up into snow country, to a mining camp that turned its back on a stranger in a blizzard, never guessing the man they'd cast out was the only one among them who knew how to bring them all home alive. You won't want to miss that one. Until then, friend, keep your powder dry, keep your word good, and keep your eyes on the horizon. This has been a work of fiction, inspired by the spirit of the old frontier, told around this campfire one more night. Good night, and ride safe.